Long before Amazon existed, there was a company that let you order almost anything you could imagine from the comfort of your home and have it delivered to your door. You did not go to a store. You opened a book, a massive book, hundreds of pages thick, filled with thousands upon thousands of products. Clothing, tools, furniture, toys, jewelry, appliances. You could order a wristwatch or a wood-burning stove. You could order car parts. You could even, at one point in history, order an entire house, a complete home, shipped to you in pieces by railroad, ready to assemble. You filled out a form, you mailed it in, and weeks later your order arrived. A retail empire built on distribution, logistics, and the radical idea that you should be able to buy anything from anywhere without ever setting foot in a shop. This was not Amazon. This was Sears. And it was doing this more than 100 years ago. For most of the 20th century, Sears was the most powerful retailer in the United States, and one of the most powerful companies in the world. It was the everything store before the everything store. It had the catalog, it had the distribution network, it had the brand trust. It had, at various points, its own credit system, its own financial services, its own iconic products. It even built the tallest building in the world. At its peak, Sears was so central to American life that it was said a huge share of American households had a Sears credit card, and that the company touched the life of nearly every family in the nation. Sears had, decades in advance, every single ingredient that would later make Amazon the most valuable company on earth. The infrastructure of selling everything to everyone, everywhere. It was Amazon before Amazon, not as a metaphor, but as a literal fact. Today, Sears is a corpse. From thousands of stores, it has dwindled to a mere handful. The catalog is gone. The empire is gone. The company that invented the idea of buying anything from home watched the internet arrive, the very technology that should have been its greatest triumph, the natural evolution of everything it had built, and it did not rise. It collapsed. And here is what makes this autopsy different from every one before it. Sears did not simply fail to adapt like Blockbuster or Kodak. In its final and most destructive chapter, Sears was actively taken apart, dismantled, hollowed out from the inside by the very man who owned it and claimed he was saving it, a brilliant, celebrated Wall Street investor who ran the company according to a theory, an ideology about how businesses should work, and applied that theory to Sears until there was almost nothing left. This is the story of how the original everything store, the company that should have become Amazon, was instead destroyed, not just by the future it failed to seize, but by a single man's conviction that he alone knew how a company should be run. My name is unimportant. What matters is the body on the table, and today, the body is Sears. Let's begin the autopsy. To understand the scale of what was lost, you first have to understand how completely Sears once dominated American life. The company began in the late 1800s, founded by Richard Sears and Alva Roebuck. Richard Sears was a salesman of rare genius, and he understood something that would not become obvious to the rest of the world for another century. He understood that the store did not have to be a place, it could be a system. At the time, most Americans lived in rural areas, far from good shops, at the mercy of small local general stores that charged high prices for limited goods. Sears saw the opportunity. Through the mail and along the expanding railroads, he could reach every farmhouse in America. He could offer them a catalog, a wish book, containing thousands of products at prices the local store could never match, delivered right to them. The Sears catalog became a phenomenon. It was, for millions of American families, a window onto the entire world of goods. Children learned to read from it. Families dreamed over it. It was so comprehensive that you could furnish an entire life from its pages, from the cradle to, quite literally, the tombstone, both of which Sears would sell you. And yes, for a period, you could order a complete house from the catalog, the famous Sears kit homes, tens of thousands of which were shipped across the country and assembled, many of which still stand today. Think about what Sears had actually built: a central warehouse and distribution operation of staggering sophistication for its era, a logistics network that could get products from manufacturers to a facility to a customer's door anywhere in the country, a trusted brand that people believed in, a system for selling everything to everyone, no store required. This is, feature for feature, the blueprint of modern e-commerce. Sears had constructed the physical and organizational machine of buy anything from home almost a century before the technology existed to move it online. And Sears did not stop at the catalog. As America changed, Sears changed with it, for a while, brilliantly. When Americans moved to the suburbs and bought cars, Sears built enormous stores and shopping centers and became the anchor of American retail. It created iconic, trusted house brands, tools, appliances, batteries, and more, names that generations of Americans swore by. It launched its own credit operations. It expanded into insurance and financial services. It built, in Chicago, the Sears Tower, for a time, the tallest building on the planet, a literal monument to its dominance, scraping the sky above the nation it clothed, furnished, and equipped. By the mid-20th century, Sears was not just a retailer. It was an institution woven into the fabric of American life, as fundamental as the highways or the television. It was one of the largest and most trusted companies in the world. To grasp how deep this went, consider what Sears meant to an ordinary American family. Sears was where you bought your first tools, and they came with a lifetime guarantee, the famous craftsman promise that if the tool ever broke, Sears would replace it, no questions asked, for as long as you lived. Sears was where you bought the appliance that ran your kitchen, the Kenmore washer that lasted 20 years. It was where you bought the battery for your car, the paint for your house, the clothes for your children, the toys for Christmas. For millions, Sears was not one store among many. It was the store, the default, the trusted center of American consumer life, a company whose word was so good that its house brands were often trusted more than the national names. And Sears understood its own customers with a depth that any modern data company would envy, except it did it with paper, relationships, and a century of accumulated knowledge. It knew what rural America needed and what suburban America wanted. It had, in its catalog operation and its credit system, a direct financial and informational relationship with a vast share of American households. It possessed, in the analog world, exactly the kind of customer intimacy and reach that companies now spend billions trying to build online. This was the summit, and it is crucial to hold this image in your mind: the sheer, overwhelming completeness of Sears's dominance, because it makes what came later so much harder to comprehend. This was a company that had already invented, in physical form, the exact business model that would one day create the richest companies in history. It was sitting on the blueprint. It just had to carry that blueprint into the digital age. It could not. And then, in its final act, it was handed to a man who did not even try to save the store, but to solve it, like an equation, until the equation equaled 0. Before we follow the body further down, I want to ask you something directly. If you find this kind of autopsy valuable, if you want to understand not just that great companies die, but the exact decision, in the exact room, that kills them, then subscribe to this channel. Every episode, we lay one fallen empire on the table, and we find the true cause of death. It costs you nothing, and it ensures the next examination finds its way to you. Now, back to the body. The first phase of Sears's decline is the familiar one, the one we have seen on this table before, the slow failure to adapt. Through the second half of the 20th century, the retail world grew more competitive. New kinds of stores emerged. The discount giants arrived, Walmart above all, offering lower prices and ruthless efficiency. Specialty retailers carved off pieces of Sears's vast empire, doing one category better than Sears did everything. And Sears, the aging giant, began to lose ground. Its stores grew tired. Its brand grew dated. Its position, once unassailable, began to erode. This was a serious problem, but not yet a fatal one. Sears was still enormous, still trusted, still rich in assets and brands and history. And crucially, as the century turned, the single greatest opportunity in the history of retail was arriving, an opportunity that seemed almost designed for Sears specifically: the Internet. Think about it. Online shopping is, at its core, the catalog reborn. It is the exact thing Sears had pioneered a century earlier. Buying anything from home, delivered to your door, now supercharged by technology. Of all the companies on earth, Sears was arguably the best positioned to dominate e-commerce. It had the distribution heritage. It had the logistics DNA. It had the trusted brand. It had the customer relationships. It had a century of institutional knowledge about exactly the thing the Internet was about to make explode. Sears should have become Amazon. It had every reason to, every tool to, and a 100-year head start on the very concept. Why then did it fail? Not through a single dramatic refusal, like Blockbuster laughing at Netflix, but through something quieter and more insidious. Sears was, by this point, an enormous, aging organization, and enormous aging organizations are built for stability, not for reinvention. Its energy was consumed by managing its vast, struggling store empire, thousands of physical locations, each with rent, staff, and inventory, each demanding attention. Its leadership was focused on defending the present, on stemming the losses, on surviving the quarter. And the Internet, in its early years, looked small and unprofitable next to the mighty river of revenue still flowing through the stores. Why pour resources into a tiny, money-losing website when the real business was the physical empire that had always paid the bills? It is the same trap we have seen again and again on this table. The profitable, familiar present crowding out the uncertain, unfamiliar future. The existing business, however troubled, feeling more real than the emerging one. Sears did not decide, in one meeting, to hand e-commerce to Amazon. It simply hesitated and delayed and prioritized the old over the new 1,000 small times until the window that had been wide open, the window it, of all companies, was best equipped to climb through, quietly closed. And a small online bookstore in Seattle climbed through it instead, and built the empire that should have been Sears's by right of invention. And it did not. Like Kodak with digital, Like Blockbuster with streaming, Sears looked at the future that was its own birthright and failed to seize it. It was slow, it was distracted, it was burdened by its aging store empire and its internal caution. The window opened, the greatest window in the history of the industry it had invented, and Sears stood at it and did not climb through. Amazon did. But here is where the Sears story stops being a familiar tale of missed adaptation and becomes something far stranger and far darker. Because Sears's real destruction did not come from the outside, from Amazon or Walmart. It came from within, from a rescue that turned into a dismemberment. It came from the man who arrived promising to save it. His name was Eddie Lampert. Eddie Lampert was, by any measure, a financial prodigy, a brilliant investor who had made a fortune running a successful hedge fund. He was spoken of, at his height, in the same breath as the greatest investors alive. He was celebrated, admired, and extraordinarily confident in his own judgment. And in the early 2000s, he turned his attention to retail. Lampert took control of Kmart, another struggling American retail giant, guiding it through bankruptcy. And then, in 2005, he engineered a massive deal, merging Kmart with Sears to create a new company, Sears Holdings. Lampert was the architect, the controlling shareholder, and eventually the chief executive. He now controlled the destiny of the original everything store. When the deal was announced, Wall Street was thrilled. Here was one of the smartest financial minds of his generation, taking command of a legendary but troubled brand. Surely, people thought, he would work his magic. Surely he would find the value locked inside this sprawling giant and set it free. He had a plan. And the plan was not really about selling more products, or delighting more customers, or building a better store. The plan was ideological. Eddie Lampert had a theory about how organizations should work, and he was about to use one of the most storied companies in American history as the laboratory for that theory. The theory was, in essence, radical free market economics applied to the inside of a single company. Let me explain what this means, because it is the murder weapon, and it is one of the strangest management decisions ever attempted at this scale. Most companies operate as a unified whole. The different divisions, the appliance department, the tool department, the marketing team, the technology group, all work together toward the common goal of the overall company's success. They cooperate, they share, they support one another, because they are all part of the same body, working for the same survival. Eddie Lampert looked at this and saw inefficiency. He was a believer in the power of markets and competition, and he came to believe that the way to make Sears efficient was to break it apart internally, to divide the company into dozens of separate units, each run like its own independent business, each with its own leadership, its own profit targets, its own budget. And then he made them compete against each other. Under Lampert's system, Sears was carved into some 30 or more separate divisions, and these divisions were not colleagues, they were rivals. Each one had to fight for resources. Each one was measured on its own individual profit, not the success of Sears as a whole. Each one, in effect, treated the others not as teammates, but as competitors, or even as vendors and customers to be negotiated against. The results were as absurd as they were destructive. Divisions began to behave like warring companies inside the same building. Units that should have been helping each other instead fought over budget, over space, over strategy. The appliance division and the tool division and the clothing division, all under the same roof, all supposedly on the same team, were pitted against one another in an internal war for survival. Consider the reported consequences. Different divisions, each protecting its own profit and loss statement, reportedly refused to cooperate in ways that would have helped the whole company. There are accounts of the company's own units competing so fiercely that they undermined one another, of executives fighting internal battles instead of the external competitors who were actually killing them. When the entire organization is restructured so that helping a colleague hurts your own numbers, people stop helping colleagues. They optimize for their own division and let the whole burn. Picture the madness of it. While Amazon was operating as a single, unified, ferociously coordinated machine, all pulling in one direction to conquer retail, Sears was tearing itself into 30 pieces and setting those pieces against each other. Lampert had taken a company that was already struggling to fight its external enemies and forced it to fight a civil war inside its own walls. The ideology had a certain intellectual elegance. In theory, internal competition would force each unit to become lean and efficient, and the strong would thrive. In practice, it did the opposite. It destroyed the cooperation, the shared purpose, and the unified strategy that any large organization needs to survive. A company is not a collection of independent markets. It is a body. And Lampert, in his conviction, had ordered the body's organs to compete with one another for blood. The predictable result was that the body began to die. To feel the full absurdity, imagine the situation on the ground. Under a system where each division fought for its own profit, cooperation became self-sabotage. If one division created a promotion that would drive customers into the stores, but the benefit landed mostly on another division's products, why would the first division pay for it? If the appliance unit wanted to feature its products prominently, but the space belonged to another unit measured on its own numbers, a negotiation ensued. Inside the same company, between people who supposedly worked for the same employer. Executives reportedly spent their energy in internal turf wars, defending their own unit's territory and budget, rather than uniting against Amazon and Walmart. Reports from inside this era describe a culture of infighting, mistrust, and dysfunction, where the incentive structure Lampert had built rewarded selfishness and punished teamwork. There is a famous idea in business that culture eats strategy for breakfast, that no clever plan survives a broken culture. Lampert's system did not just fail to build a good culture, it engineered a hostile one, by design, on purpose, as a matter of principle. He had taken the natural cooperative instinct of an organization and inverted it, turning colleagues into competitors and teamwork into a liability. And he did this not by accident, but because he believed, with the certainty of a true ideologue, that this was the superior way to run a business. And this was only half of the destruction, because alongside the ideological experiment ran a financial strategy that drained the company of the very assets it needed to fight. Sears, remember, was more than 100 years of accumulated value. It owned things. It owned an enormous portfolio of valuable real estate, the land and buildings under its many stores, some in prime locations worth vast sums. It owned iconic, trusted brands built over generations. These assets were the company's foundation, the accumulated treasure of a century of dominance. Under Lampert's leadership, Sears increasingly became a company that survived by selling off its own treasure, to raise cash, to fund operations, to keep the lights on. The company sold assets. Valuable real estate was spun off and sold. Beloved brands were sold. The crown jewels, the irreplaceable products of a century of building, were pawned, piece by piece, to keep the failing enterprise breathing a little longer. And here is the detail that echoes the darkest parts of the Toys R Us story. Some of these transactions benefited entities connected to Lampert himself. As Sears sold off its prime real estate, a significant portion of it went to a company that Lampert had a major stake in. As the company borrowed money to survive, some of that lending came from Lampert's own hedge fund. Lampert was, in various ways, on multiple sides of these deals, the owner of the sinking company and a beneficiary of the assets and debt being carved out of it. Now, Lampert and his defenders have always argued that he was trying to save the company, that he poured his own money and credit into keeping it alive far longer than anyone else would have, that these transactions were legitimate efforts to provide the cash Sears desperately needed. And it is true that he kept Sears breathing, on life support, for years longer than most expected. But step back and look at the shape of what happened. A century-old company, rich in real estate and brands, was steadily stripped of those assets. The value that had taken 100 years to build flowed outward, and much of it flowed toward the man in control and the entities connected to him. Meanwhile, the actual stores, the thing customers experienced, were starved. Reports from this era describe Sears stores that were dim, understaffed, poorly stocked, with empty shelves and broken displays, and an atmosphere of decay. The company was not investing in the customer experience. It was selling its bones to survive, while the stores rotted. You cannot save a retailer by making its stores worse. And Sears's stores, in its final years, became monuments to neglect, the physical evidence of a company being consumed from the inside. I want to pause the timeline here, because this is the part of the autopsy that matters most. Not what happened to Sears, why it happened. And Sears offers us a why, unlike any other body on this table, a fusion of the failures we have seen before, plus one entirely new and chilling ingredient. Blockbuster died of comfort, Kodak of nostalgia, Nokia of arrogance, BlackBerry of expertise. Toys R Us was killed by financial extraction. But Sears combines the slow failure to adapt with the extraction of value, and adds something the others did not have: the rule of ideology over reality. Let me show you the three forces that killed it. The first force is the failure to seize the inheritance. This is the tragedy that opens the story. Sears possessed, more than any company on earth, the birthright to dominate e-commerce. It had invented the model, and it could not carry that model across the technological bridge into the new era. Like Kodak holding the digital camera, Sears held the entire concept of sell everything to everyone from home, and watched a newcomer build it into the most valuable company in the world. The lesson here is brutal. Having the perfect assets for the future is worthless if you cannot bring yourself to actually use them. Amazon did not out-invent Sears. Amazon simply did what Sears already knew how to do, but with conviction and speed, while Sears hesitated. The second force is the tyranny of ideology over reality. This is the new and defining sickness of the Sears story. Eddie Lampert did not run Sears based on what the stores needed, or what customers wanted, or what the market demanded. He ran it based on a theory, a deeply held belief about how organizations should be structured. And when the theory collided with reality, when internal competition produced chaos instead of efficiency, he did not abandon the theory. The conviction was so strong that the evidence could not break it. This is one of the most dangerous things a powerful leader can do: to love an idea more than the truth. To be so certain of your own brilliant theory that you will reshape reality to fit it, rather than reshaping your theory to fit reality. Lampert was, by all accounts, genuinely brilliant. But brilliance devoted to a flawed conviction does not save a company, it destroys it more efficiently. The third force is the confusion of financial engineering with business building. Lampert was a financial genius, not a retailer, and he approached Sears the way a financier approaches an asset, as a collection of parts to be valued, optimized, and monetized, rather than as a living business to be nurtured and grown. Under this lens, selling off the real estate made sense, squeezing the divisions made sense, extracting the value made sense. Every move was rational as finance. But retail is not finance. Retail is stores and products, and the experience of a customer walking through a door. You cannot spreadsheet your way to a great store. And a leader who sees only the financial machinery and not the human business beneath it will optimize the numbers right up until the moment the business underneath those numbers ceases to exist. Failure to seize the inheritance, the rule of ideology over reality, and financial engineering mistaken for business building. That is the specific disease that killed this specific giant. And notice how Sears gathers up threads from every autopsy before it. The missed future of Kodak, the extraction of Toys R Us, and adds the uniquely human tragedy of a brilliant man so in love with his own idea that he could not see it was killing the very thing he claimed to be saving. Now, let us watch the empire fall. The collapse of Sears was long and slow and painful. A death by 1,000 cuts stretched over more than a decade. Year after year, the numbers told the same grim story. Sales fell. Losses mounted. Store after store closed. The empire that had once numbered thousands of locations shrank and shrank and shrank. Each year, Lampert would explain the strategy, promise a turnaround, point to some new plan. And each year, the company grew smaller and weaker. The stores became notorious. Once proud Sears locations decayed into dim, half-empty spaces with bare shelves and skeleton staff. Customers who had trusted the brand for generations walked into these stores, saw the decay, and did not come back. The neglect became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Bad stores drove away customers, which reduced revenue, which meant even less money to fix the stores, which made them worse. The downward spiral fed on itself. Meanwhile, the assets kept flowing out. More real estate sold. More brands sold. The iconic house brands that generations of Americans had trusted were sold off or licensed away. The company was quite literally disassembling itself, converting a century of accumulated value into cash to fund a few more months, a few more years of survival, while the underlying business continued to bleed. The financial maneuvers grew ever more complex, a tangle of loans and asset sales and transactions involving Lampert's own entities, all aimed at keeping the enterprise alive. But you cannot borrow and sell your way to health. Every maneuver bought time at the cost of substance. The company was eating itself. And finally, the substance ran out. In 2018, Sears Holdings filed for bankruptcy. The original everything store, the company that had clothed and furnished and equipped America for over a century, the company that had invented the very concept of buying anything from home, the company that should have become Amazon, filed for bankruptcy protection, buried under debt, drained of its assets, its stores in ruins. Even then, Lampert fought to keep a shell of it alive, buying the remnants out of bankruptcy through his hedge fund and continuing to operate a shrinking handful of stores. But the empire was gone. From thousands of stores to a scattered few. From the most powerful retailer in the world to a footnote. From the everything store to almost nothing. So what killed Sears? The comfortable answer is Amazon, the internet, Walmart, the relentless disruption of retail. That is the answer that lets everyone involved walk away clean, because it makes Sears just another old store that could not survive the digital age. But you have seen the evidence yourself, and the evidence tells a more complicated and more damning story. Sears was not killed simply by failing to see the future. It had invented the future, the entire model of selling everything from home. A century before Amazon, the blueprint was in its hands. Sears was not killed by a lack of assets. It was rich in real estate, in brands, in customer trust, in 100 years of accumulated value. It had more than enough to fund a real transformation. Sears was not, in the end, killed only from the outside. In its final and most destructive chapter, it was taken apart from within, its divisions set against each other by an ideology, its assets stripped away by financial engineering, its stores left to rot while its value flowed outward. What killed Sears was a fatal combination. First, the failure to carry its own brilliant inheritance across the bridge to the digital age. And then, fatally, a decade under a leader so convinced of his own theory that he restructured a struggling giant into a civil war, sold off its treasure to keep his experiment running, and optimized the company, rationally and relentlessly, all the way into the ground. Amazon did not have to kill Sears. Sears, in its inheritance, was Amazon's equal or better. What Sears lacked was not the tools, it was the will to use them, and then the misfortune of being handed to a man who used his considerable brilliance not to build the store, but to solve it, like a problem, like an equation, until the answer came out to zero. There is a lesson here, and it may be the most important one we have uncovered yet. The thing that makes you powerful is almost always the thing that kills you. But Sears adds a second, darker lesson on top of the first. Sears's greatest asset, its century-old mastery of selling everything from anywhere, should have made it the natural king of the internet age. Instead, that very legacy, that vast empire of stores and systems built for the old world, became the weight that made it too slow and too cautious to seize the new one. The inheritance became the anchor. But the deeper lesson is about the danger of the brilliant, certain leader. It is tempting to believe that a company in trouble simply needs a genius to come and save it. Sears got its genius. It got one of the most celebrated financial minds of the age, a man of undeniable intelligence and iron conviction, and that genius, precisely because he was so brilliant and so certain, was able to inflict a more thorough and creative destruction than any ordinary manager ever could have. He did not fail through stupidity. He failed through the relentless, confident application of a flawed idea, backed by enough intelligence to pursue it to the bitter end. This is the terrifying truth. Intelligence is not the same as wisdom. Conviction is not the same as correctness. And a brilliant leader in love with a wrong idea is far more dangerous than a mediocre one who knows he must listen. The smarter you are, the more thoroughly you can execute a mistake, and the longer you can convince everyone, including yourself, that it is working. Sears had everything, the blueprint of the future, 100 years early, the most trusted brand in America, a treasury of real estate and beloved products, a financial genius at the helm, and it lost all of it. Not simply because the world changed, but because it could not seize the future it had itself invented. and then, in its final years, was reshaped, rationally and brilliantly according to a theory, until there was nothing left to reshape. That was the fatal decision, to love an idea more than the truth, to solve a company instead of saving it. The body is closed, the cause of death is recorded, and somewhere out there, right now, another struggling giant is being handed to another brilliant, certain leader with a beautiful theory about how everything should work, and the board is applauding and calling it a rescue. If this autopsy taught you something, subscribe and stay with us, because next time there will be another body on the table. There always is. I'll see you in the next examination.